Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and also a proud member of the City Club. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Jason Riley. Mr. Riley joined the Wall Street Journal back in 1994, more or less fresh out of college. For 20 years, he wrote opinion pieces on politics, economics, education, immigration, and race. He was named a senior editorial page writer in 2000 and a member of the editorial board in 2005. In 2008, he published Let Them In, which argues for a free market-oriented U.S. immigration policy. His second book, Please Stop Helping Us, which is about the track record of government efforts to help the black underclass, was published in 2014. Please Stop Helping Us traces the history of liberal poverty programs that, Mr. Riley argues, have succeeded politically but failed socially. Affirmative action programs, progressive education theories, minimum wage laws, and other labor market interferences created with the intent to help black Americans have not only failed, he argues, but have become the main reason for nearly all of their problems: unemployment, low income, family disorganization, violence, incarceration, and the education gap. Proponents applaud Mr. Riley's ability to, quote, destroy propaganda and puncture inflated rhetoric, while critics point to his failure to acknowledge the legacy of slavery and the role of institutionalized racism. Mr. Riley sums up his case, however, this way, quote, half a century after the civil rights battles were fought and won, liberalism remains much more interested in making excuses for blacks rather than in reevaluating efforts to help them. Mr. Riley was born in Buffalo, New York, and holds a bachelor's degree in English from the State University of New York at Buffalo. And it was in February of this year that he became full-time a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor for Fox News. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Jason Riley.
Thank you for that introduction, Dan, and thank all of you for having me here today. I appreciate the invitation, and looking at the Wall of Fame Dan showed me out there earlier, it's quite distinguished company to be in. So thank you very much for that introduction. My first book was about immigration. This one's about race. I picked the easy subjects, the ones that bring us together as a country. Actually, the book on race has done a lot better than the book on immigration, and so I've concluded that no one cares what black people think about immigration. That's my takeaway from that experience. 2015 is an important year in civil rights history because it marks the 50th anniversary of what may be Dr. King's most significant achievement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which outlawed discrimination based on race and gender and religion and gave blacks access to jobs and schools and public facilities that previously had been closed off to them. But access to the voting booth, access to the ballot was still, of course, a challenge for blacks, particularly in the South. Lincoln said, "We're government of the people, by the people, and for the people," but that's only true if all the people can register and vote. The ability to vote, of course, is what protects all of the other freedoms we enjoy in this country. It's how we hold our elected officials responsible for the decisions they make. So after the Civil Rights Act was passed, Dr. King pressed for a Voting Rights Act as well. And 50 years ago, this summer, President Johnson signed it into law. And it's been a remarkable success. Just to give you a sense of how successful the Voting Rights Act has been, in 1964, the year before it passed, only 7% of blacks in the state of Mississippi were registered to vote. That was the lowest percentage of anywhere in the South. But by 1966, just 1 year after the Voting Rights Act passed, the black voter registration rate in Mississippi had climbed to 60%, the highest in the South. And Mississippi was no outlier in this respect. It went from 19% to 51% over the same period in Georgia. In fact, in every southern state, the gains were striking. Today, black voter registration in the South where most blacks still live, is higher than it is in other parts of the country. And in 2012, the last presidential election year, the percentage of blacks who voted was higher than the percentage of whites who voted for the first time in U.S. history. That's how significant the Voting Rights Act has been. Along with the Civil Rights Act of '64, it represented the culmination of a modern-day civil rights movement. And what I wanted to talk about this afternoon for a few minutes is what has happened in the wake of these civil rights victories, what has risen from the ruins of Jim Crow in terms of policies aimed at blacks in general and the black underclass in particular. Where has there been progress? Where has there been retrogression? What's working? What's not working? And how much of what's not working can be blamed on residual racism in America? Last year, I published a book about the track record of various government efforts to help the black underclass following these civil rights victories. Just before signing the Voting Rights Act into law, Lyndon Johnson gave a famous speech at Howard University in Washington, D.C., where he talked about what the government should do next on behalf of blacks. This was merely the end of the beginning, he said. And then he said, that beginning is freedom, and the barriers to that freedom are tumbling down. Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society, to vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school, said Johnson. But freedom is not enough, he said. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him and bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say you are free to compete with all the others and think you've been fair to that person. Johnson said the next and more profound stage in the battle for civil rights was not just equality as a right, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. Johnson was pushing for equal outcomes as a measure of black progress. But what if Johnson was mistaken? What if there are limits to what the government can do beyond removing barriers to freedom? What if the best that we can hope for from our elected officials are policies that promote equal opportunity? What if public policymakers risk creating more problems and barriers to progress when the focus is on equal outcomes, where Johnson wanted to put it? I think there are limits, even when the policies are well-intentioned. And I think the past half-century is evidence of that. For more than 50 years, the political left has pushed for more government assistance for blacks through racial preferences, forced integration, expanded welfare entitlements, and so forth. But the track record here is appalling. While gains have been made, significant racial disparities remain in some areas, and black retrogression has occurred in others. The black-white poverty gap has widened over the past decade, and black poverty is no longer even falling in this country. The black-white disparity in incarceration rates today is larger than it was in 1960. And the black unemployment rate has, on average, been double the white rate for 50 years. I argue that blacks ultimately must help themselves. They must develop the same attitudes and habits and behaviors that other groups developed in order to rise in America. And to the extent that a government policy, however well-intentioned, interferes with this necessary self-development, it does more harm than good. Open-ended welfare benefits do not help people develop a work ethic, which is ultimately what they must develop in order to rise out of poverty. Minimum wage laws price younger, less experienced people out of the labor force, a disproportionate number of whom happen to be black. Soft on crime laws make ghettos more dangerous for the mostly law-abiding residents who live there. And they make life easier for the criminals who primarily prey on the black poor, and so on. But it's also important to note the progress that was occurring among blacks prior to the implementation of these programs designed to help them. Programs that often receive all of the credit for any progress that we have seen. For example, between 1940 and 1960, black poverty in the U.S. fell by 40 percentage points. That was before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. That was during Jim Crow. That was during a period of open, rampant, and legal discrimination in this country. Racial discrimination. A 40 percentage point drop in black poverty. Now, poverty continued to fall after the Great Society programs were implemented in the 1960s, but at a much slower rate. At best, the Great Society continued a trend already in place. Yet these programs are given all the credit for the reductions in poverty that we see today. The reality is that no Great Society program has ever come close to matching the reduction in black poverty that we saw prior to the Great Society. No Great Society program has ever come close to matching what blacks were doing on their own before the government decided to step in and help in the form of an anti-poverty program. Affirmative action, racial preferences are another example of a program that gets more credit than it deserves. In this case, credit for increasing the size of the black middle class in this country. I say not so fast. Between 1930 and 1970, the percentage of black white-collar workers quadrupled in America. That was before affirmative action policies were implemented. That was during a period when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire blacks." Yet in the face of these obstacles, blacks were entering the skilled professions at an unprecedented rate. Yes, blacks continue to enter the white-collar professions in the wake of racial preferences. But again, this simply continued an existing trend. There was a substantial black middle class already in existence by the end of the 1960s. It has continued to grow, but at a much slower rate. As with black poverty reduction, no affirmative action program has ever come close to matching what blacks were doing on their own prior to the implementation of the program. Moreover, racial preferences have not been a boon to the poor, as proponents promised. Instead, it has worked mostly to help already well-off blacks become better off. There have been case studies in Atlanta, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, where under black mayors like Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young, the city implemented racial preference policies for hiring black city workers and black contractors. What happened? Well, the number of successful black businesses increased rapidly, but average income blacks were left behind, and the black poor lost ground. And that's been the story of the black poor not only in Atlanta, but nationwide. In the era of affirmative action, the black underclass has lost ground, both in absolute terms and relative to the white underclass. In the 1970s and 80s, and even into the 90s, those would be the first full decades of the affirmative action policies. The poorest 20% of blacks saw their incomes decline at more than double the rate of comparable whites. Again, the empirical data shows that in an era of racial preferences and quotas and set-asides put in place to help the black poor, that subset has regressed. We've had more than 4 decades of affirmative action policies. Let's put aside, for now, whether they violate the Civil Rights Act or the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Let's put aside whether or not a racial spoils system in a country as diverse as America is helpful or harmful. Let's just focus on something more simple. Does affirmative action work as intended? It's been sold as a way to reduce black poverty and increase the black professional ranks. After 4+ decades, what does the track record show? I think it shows that many of these policies not only aren't helping, but they're harming. I would also argue that there's a large cultural component to the racial disparities that we see today, whether we're talking about employment, education, incarceration, income, or other measures. Yet it has become almost taboo to talk about black cultural problems. The book is not an autobiography or a memoir, but I do tell a few stories about growing up black and male in the inner city. And one of those stories involves a trip back home to Buffalo, New York, where I was born and raised. I was visiting my older sister shortly after I'd begun working at the Wall Street Journal, and I was chatting with her daughter, my niece, who was maybe 7 or 8 years old at the time. I was asking her about school and her favorite subjects, that sort of thing, when she stopped me and said, "Uncle Jason, why you talk white?" And she turned to her little friend, who was there with her, and said, "Don't my uncle sound white? Why are you trying to sound so smart?" Now, she was just teasing, of course. I smiled, and they enjoyed a little chuckle at my expense, but what she said stayed with me. I couldn't help thinking, here were 2 young black girls, 7 or 8 years old, already linking speech patterns to race and intelligence. They already had a rather sophisticated awareness that as blacks, white-sounding speech was not only to be avoided in their own speech, but mocked in the speech of others. Now, I shouldn't have been too surprised by this, and I wasn't. My siblings, along with countless other black friends and relatives, teased me the same way when I was growing up. And other black professionals, from the President and First Lady on down, have told similar stories. What I'd forgotten is just how early these attitudes take hold, how soon this counterproductive thinking and behavior begins. New York City, where I'm based, has the largest school system in America, and 80% of black kids in New York City public schools are performing below grade level. 80%. And a big part of the problem is a black subculture that rejects attitudes and behaviors that are conducive to academic success. Black kids read half as many books and watch twice as much television as their white counterparts, for example. In other words, a big part of the problem is a culture that produces little black girls and boys who are already worried about acting and sounding white by the time they are in the 2nd grade. Another big part of the problem is a reluctance to speak honestly about these cultural shortcomings. Many whites fear being called racist, and many black leaders have a vested interest in blaming black problems primarily on white racism. So that is the narrative they push, regardless of the reality. Racism has become an all-purpose explanation for bad black outcomes, be they social or economic. If you disagree and are white, you're a bigot. If you disagree and are black, you're a sellout. Too often, this is the level of discourse, schoolyard name-calling, ad hominem attacks aimed at shutting down the debate. Even President Obama has been subjected to this treatment when he broaches the topic of black cultural shortcomings. On several occasions, he's spoken to black audiences about absent fathers. When he spoke at Morehouse, a black college in Atlanta, a couple years ago, he said, "I was raised by a heroic single mother and wonderful grandparents who made incredible sacrifices for me. But I still wish I had a father who was not only present but involved. And so my whole life, I've tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father wasn't for my mother and me. I've tried to be a better father, a better husband, a better man." Obama told those black men in the audience to be good role models for other, less fortunate black men. He said that the brothers who have been left behind, who haven't had the same opportunities we have, they need to hear from us. We need to be in the barbershops with them, at church with them, helping to pull them up, exposing them to new opportunities. We have to teach them what it means to be a man. Now that might sound like common sense to you and me. And I'm sure there are some people in this room who wish this is all Obama would ever talk about. But Obama gets slammed by liberals in general and black liberals in particular when he says these sorts of things, because he's seen as criticizing black culture, condescending to blacks, being an elitist. Most significantly, he's accused of letting whites off the hook, which is a no-no on the black left. But the facts are on Obama's side in this regard. For decades, studies have shown that the likelihood of teen pregnancy, drug abuse, dropping out of school, and many other bad social outcomes increases dramatically when fathers are not around. one of the most comprehensive studies ever done about this, concluded that black boys without a father were 68% more likely to be incarcerated than those with a father. The study said that overall, the most critical factor affecting the prospect that a male youth will encounter the criminal justice system is the presence of a father in the home. All other factors, including family income, are much less important, according to the study. The social scientist James Q. Wilson once put it this way: if crime is to a significant degree caused by weak character, if weak character is more likely among children of unmarried mothers, if there are no fathers who will help raise their children, acquire jobs, and protect their neighborhoods, if boys become young men with no preparation for work, if school achievement is regarded as a sign of having sold out, if all these things are true, then the chances of reducing the crime rate among low-income blacks anytime soon is slim. But try bringing up black culture in a debate over criminal behavior today. I dare you. You will have your head handed to you. Try bringing up the breakdown of the black family in a debate about crime. In fact, we don't even talk about crime anymore. We talk about incarceration rates, as if incarceration rates have no relation at all to black behavior. We talk about police shootings of black men as a measure of whether America values black lives or whether cops value black lives. We've had mobs of people all over the country pretending that there is an epidemic of cops shooting blacks for no reason. And the media has played right along. This is nonsense. Police are involved in approximately 2% of black shooting deaths in this country each year. In fact, a cop is about 6 times as likely to be shot by someone black than the opposite scenario. In March of this year, 4 cops were killed over a 7-day period. And by the way, all of them were black. How many of you were aware of that? Where were the hashtags on Twitter? Where was the wall-to-wall media coverage? Where were the outraged protesters? Where were the civil rights leaders? Where was the White House press conference? Do these Black Lives matter? There were more than 400 homicides in Chicago last year, and about 300 of the victims were black. That's more than double the number of black deaths at the hands of police in the entire country in a given year. Can we even consider the possibility that perhaps the bigger problem might be racial disparities in antisocial behavior, not racial disparities in the composition of law enforcement agencies and elected officials? Can we even have that discussion? The answer is no, we can't, it seems. Blacks are about 13% of the population in this country, but commit more than half of all murders. And 90% of their victims are other blacks. The question isn't whether cops value black lives or America values black lives. Isn't the more relevant question whether black people value black lives? Whether the black men doing all this killing value black lives? Are we supposed to hold whites to a higher standard than blacks hold each other? Homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men in the U.S., and it is not because cops are shooting them. Rogue cops should be punished to the full extent of the law, and law enforcement should certainly be held to a high standard for violating the public trust. But if you believe that black lives matter, if you want to reduce the black body count, as a practical matter, should you focus on the 2% of black shooting deaths that involve cops or the 98% that don't? Let me close by noting that this concept of self-help and self-development that I think is essential to black advancement is something that black leaders once understood all too well, and at a time when blacks faced infinitely more obstacles than they face today. Frederick Douglass said in 1865 that everyone had asked him and the other abolitionists what to do with the Negro. He said, "I've had but one answer from the beginning: do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is that you give him a chance to stand on his own legs." Douglass was essentially saying, give blacks equal opportunity and then leave us alone. Booker T. Washington, who like Douglass was born a slave, echoed that sentiment. He said that it's important that the rights and privileges of the law be ours, all of the rights and privileges of the law. But it is vastly more important, he said, that we be prepared for the exercise of these privileges once we have them. Douglass and Washington didn't play down the need for the government to secure equal rights for blacks, and both were optimistic that blacks would eventually receive those rights, although neither man lived to see that. But both men also understood the limits of government benevolence. Blacks would have to ready themselves to meet the far bigger challenge of being in a position to take advantage of opportunities once equal rights had been secured. Dr. King also understood this. He once told a black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" He said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." I used those statements from King in a Wall Street Journal column a few years ago, and some readers accused me of making up the quotes. They come from a profile of King in Harper's Magazine in 1961. I was a little taken aback by the accusation because the article can be located pretty easily on Google. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility, which might tell you everything you need to know about what passes for black leadership today. On that happy note, I will stop and take questions if you have them.
Today we are enjoying a Friday forum featuring Jason Riley, author, Wall Street Journal columnist, Fox News contributor, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. We encourage you to organize your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you're listening to us on the radio, on WCPN, or via our website, cityclub.org, you can tweet your questions using the hashtag CityClub, or simply tweet them at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those of you joining us via our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron, Ohio's Polytechnic University, as we learned very recently. Be sure to join us next Tuesday, June 2nd at noon, when we present a panel conversation on the future of historically black colleges and universities. And also be sure to join us Wednesday, July 22nd, as we welcome Dr. Ben Carson, candidate for the Republican nomination for president. For more information about any of our upcoming and past forums, there are plenty between those two, by the way, please visit us online at cityclub.org. We welcome guests at tables hosted by Cumberland Development, LLC, and the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage Stop the Hate Essay Contest winners. We thank you very much for your support and your presence today. Now it's time to return to Mr. Riley for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphone today is our City Club Content Associate, Teddy Eisenberg. Our first question, please.
Thank you so much for your very courageous remarks today here at the City Club. And I wanted to go back to what you were talking about at the beginning about policies and policies that focus on equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity. And I was wondering if there are any policies that you see that could be helpful in fostering more equality of opportunity, or is it just a cultural problem and the best we can do is kind of stand back and let people sort that out for themselves?
Well, I think that there are policies in place now that are harmful, and that we should stop doing certain things that I think are harmful, and I think that in and of itself would be helpful. I don't think we need more government intervention. I think we need less. So we keep raising the minimum wage in this country. Los Angeles recently raised the minimum wage, voted to raise the minimum wage $15 an hour. The Brookings Institution did a study last year on the worst places for youths to find work in America. 100 biggest cities. LA ranked 98 out of 100. Raising the minimum wage is not going to help that situation. It's sold as an anti-poverty measure, but poor households don't need a raise. They need workers. And to the extent that raising the minimum wage reduces employment opportunities, you're not helping to address poverty. So it's policies like that. We have education policies in this country that keep kids trapped in failing schools. We need to stop doing that. We need to give them access to a better education. So I think we should change those policies. So I think there are things that can be done. I don't know if it's in the form of an additional policy, however. I think a good start would simply be to do things that we know aren't working. Stop doing things that we know aren't working.
Mr. Riley, I agree with your position that blacks, as with every other group, ought to help themselves. But this notion that government intervention has caused harm is deeply troubling. I would suggest that you are offering a simplistic solution or observation to a very complex dynamic that has had its roots in American slavery. So let's talk about one of those government policies, affirmative action. Affirmative action certainly is an emotionally charged concept that I believe has failed significantly, but it has a misnomer of providing unqualified blacks opportunities. But the fact of the matter is, it was created to create equal opportunity. But conscious and unconscious biases are preventing equal opportunity. So if not affirmative action, then what action needs to be taken to in fact create equal opportunity?
Well, what I've tried to do is look at what was going on prior to the implementation of policies aimed at helping the black underclass. Now, you can point to a legacy of slavery being responsible for the outcomes we see today, but then you need to explain why generations closer to slavery had better outcomes than what we see today. You have to explain how that legacy skipped a few generations and then reasserted itself. As I mentioned before, you had blacks leaving poverty at a higher rate in the 30s, 40s, and 50s than in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. If the legacy of slavery is responsible, how do you explain that? Generations in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were much closer to the institution. You mentioned affirmative action as being helpful. I disagree. I spoke about affirmative action in contracting and with respect to the case studies that have been done in places like Atlanta. But let's look at higher education. Again, we have 4 decades of this now. When the University of California ended racial preferences in college admissions back in 1996, black college graduation rates went up, not just throughout the University of California system in general. They went up in the most difficult disciplines of math and science and engineering by more than 50%. Black college graduation rates had been declining in the 80s. After racial preferences ended, they went up. And they went up because kids were being better matched with schools where they can handle the work. They did what white kids and what Asian kids did. They went to schools where they matched the credentials of the average student at that school, and therefore more of them were graduating. A perfect example of this is a study done at MIT some years ago. Black students at MIT scored in the top 10% on the math section of the SAT of all kids in the country. You're talking about some very bright kids. But they were in the bottom 10% among their peers at MIT. So kids who would be hitting it out of the park at a less selective institution were struggling at MIT. And that's because they were primarily at MIT because the administrators at MIT wanted the racial mix to look right there. They were there for diversity reasons. Whether they graduated was a secondary concern to MIT. That is my problem with affirmative action. It does not work. It sets up kids to fail. So, again, I'm looking at what was going on before these policies were put in place, what's gone on afterwards, comparing and contrasting.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for coming. Enjoyed your speech. I'm not as learned as a lot of these guys here. I didn't go to college. I served in the Marine Corps. But I'm going to try to articulate what
I think that makes you more learned than most people in the room. And thank you for your service.
No problem. Have you ever, mine's more of a personal question to you. I read some of your op-ed pieces, especially the one you did about Monahan, the congressman who passed, when you said that he was right. Mm-hmm. And when actually, if you look at some of the statistics that maybe you're presenting to this room, somebody can come along and say the statistics aren't right, because what Monahan said was, as we put this law into motion, as we put this act, the Welfare Act, into motion to help, he also said people are attaching things to it that will be harmful. You know, like the black male can't be in the family. You know, these things have been attached. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt put ideas into motion, things were attached to say, well, it gives the states rights to discriminate against the so-called Negro. So as you say, well, these policies weren't able to help. Wasn't it also that the policies were hijacked by those who did not want the policies to be helped, to be in a position to help anybody? And as you, in this large audience, are just throwing out the statistics, are you sometimes scared that maybe you threw a statistic out that said that it kind of slanted it one way against, you know?
Well, I guess I wouldn't question the motives of Great Society proponents. I think they were well-intentioned. I think Johnson and his supporters and, frankly, as I say in the book, I think that the 50s in particular and the civil rights victories of the mid-60s were liberalism at its best. I think that was the pinnacle of the civil rights movement and of liberalism. With respect to Moynihan, his report was about what he saw in terms of family disintegration in the black community. He saw trends forming, and he worried that they were going to get worse as time went on if we didn't do something about them. And he was writing particularly about black men and fatherless homes. And I say he was right because those trends have continued. As late as the mid-'60s, early to mid-'60s, 2 out of 3 black children were raised by a mother and a father. Today, more than 70% are not. And in some of our inner cities, it's as high as 80 or 90%. This is extremely troubling. I mean, it has real world consequences, economic consequences. The black poverty rate in America for married couples is in the single digits. and has been for more than 20 years. There's your anti-poverty program. Get married before you have children. We don't need another huge wealth redistribution scheme. We don't need slavery reparations. We need to restore the black family. And as you said, there have been, prior to the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, which helped in this regard, you had social programs in place that discouraged intact households. If a woman was receiving government assistance, she would risk losing that assistance if the father of her children lived with her. Now, again, we addressed some of this in the 96 Welfare Reform Act, but I think we could go much further in that regard. So, yes, these policies, again, were well-intentioned, but in many cases they put in place poor incentives, I believe, that have led to the breakup or the significant damage, done significant damage to the black family.
So, thanks again for sharing your thoughts. So I had a question. You mentioned the media and how blacks are pretty much major consumers of media. Could you talk about the anti-success messaging?
I'm sorry, I mentioned
the
that
media.
Blacks are major consumers of media? No, I did not.
Well, you said that blacks watch more TV than
I said
than
that
white
studies have
counterparts.
shown that black children read half as many books and watch twice as much television as their white and Asian counterparts, yes.
Okay. There are other studies that show that blacks are also, they use and consume more social media than white counterparts as well.
Okay.
So with that being said, could you talk about the anti-success messaging in rap music and the poverty of aspiration, how it pertains to black excellence and black progression? And basically what I mean is that, how can I say this? You say that this policy, and I would argue that there is more of a damage coming from the anti-success messaging in rap music and other forms of media that showcase success as being maybe a drug dealer selling drugs or whatever else, and that's being emulated by our young blacks.
Well, I guess the gangster rap music is a reflection of certain sensibilities in black culture that are not conducive to succeeding in society. Yeah, I would agree that's the case. I think many parents would agree with you. I'm a parent. I would agree with you on that. You want to shield your children away from this sort of thing. I kind of wish that responsible adults would denounce it as such instead of explaining it away or trying to rationalize it or justify it in some way. But certainly, I think it's damaging and is pushing a value system out there into the ether that a lot of impressionable young kids pick up on. And I think it has some impact on their attitudes towards work and school and so forth. Just to make another point, we talk about these problems in the inner city with respect to the availability of jobs. I remember after the Baltimore situation went down, people thought, well, this is a reflection of these young black men who are out here rioting, not having any place to work, and we've got to deal with unemployment and that sort of thing. But to get to your point about the sensibilities on display in this rap music and how they infiltrate these communities, a Washington Post reporter interviewed a construction worker in Baltimore at one of the sites that had been looted. And this guy said, he was a black gentleman, and he said, every day I see 30 or 40 young black men walk by this construction site. Maybe one or two will ask if we're hiring. So, yes, we need more jobs for these kids, but you also need a work ethic. You can have all the jobs in the world. If there's no desire to work, if you're glorifying some other form of employment, legal or illegal, mostly, with respect to the rap sensibilities you were talking about, that's a problem too. The same with education. Yes, we need better schools, as I mentioned, in low-income communities, but you also need a culture that values education to take advantage of being able to attend those better schools. So it's got to be, I think in a large sense, it is cultural. And that is not something that a government policy, I think, is going to provide the solution to.
Hi, good afternoon. You had mentioned that there was a kind of a sharp decline in poverty rates for blacks through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And my understanding of that is that that was due to blacks moving to northern industrial areas.
In part, yes.
Yeah, from the South. They were able to gain employment that was much higher than those wages.
It was also due to the war economy. America was booming
Exactly.
at that time, yes.
So as blacks then moved into northern or industrialized areas, a lot of the places of employment or housing that was available to them was pretty much segregated. If you look at any major American city, Cleveland included, it's really divided along race, east and west here in Cleveland. How do you think some of the structural issues have affected what we're seeing in terms of black outcomes? So access to financial resources, mostly check cashing or grocery stores or those type of resources that simply aren't available in a lot of these communities. How can those issues be addressed with policy?
Well, again, you're looking to the government for solutions to these things. I'm not. I'm not looking to the government for solutions to these things. I think that a lot of these, well, let me put it this way. We had a lot of rioting, major riots in the 60s, in the mid-60s in particular. Places like Watts, places like Detroit, places like Newark, places like Baltimore after King's assassination. Industry left a lot of these places after those riots. And a lot of these places have never recovered. But you have to look at what was going on before the rioting. The National Urban League had declared Watts, Los Angeles, one of the best places in America for black families. Incomes were higher than the national average. Unemployment was lower than the national average. Yet this is the place where the riots broke out. In Detroit, at the time of the Detroit riots, the black unemployment rate in Detroit was lower than the white unemployment rate in the country. Detroit was a booming city. Many blacks had jobs. Following the riots, many of these communities became blighted and have never recovered. Newark is another example of this. So you're attributing things to structural problems that I'm not sure I agree with there. And in terms of segregation, this comes up with respect to schools a lot, whether black kids need to be sitting next to white kids in order to learn, whether education reforms like charter schools are damaging because many of them have segregated classrooms or segregated schools, de facto segregated schools, of course, based on the communities they serve. I'm less concerned about that. I'm more concerned about whether the kids are learning than the color of the skin of the person sitting next to them. And if a school's working and kids are learning, I don't have a problem with that. There can be all black communities that are perfectly safe. We have cities with largely black suburbs. This occurs. I don't see this. If you, and I think often the government in this respect does more harm than good as well. And I'll give you an example in the form of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which goes around the country filing lawsuits or threatening to file lawsuits in white communities where they don't see enough black people living, automatically assuming that something is amiss. It's almost like they have an aesthetic sensibility of how residential housing patterns should look, and when they don't see the right racial mix, they assume something is wrong. But that hasn't been the case for decades. If you go to a wealthy suburb, like I'll use an example outside of New York City, like a Scarsdale. if you are a black person who can afford a home in Scarsdale, you can live there. There's no government office in the county with discrimination complaints piled high of blacks who tried to move into Scarsdale and were denied access or were discriminated against by brokers. That is not what is going on. The problem occurs when the government tries to shoehorn people into neighborhoods where they otherwise cannot afford to live. That is what creates the tension, and that is what we have seen happen throughout the country. So again, you're looking to the government for solutions. I think in many cases, they've been the problem, the cause of a lot of the tension that we've seen.
Thank you for appearing today. I'd like to also thank you for recognizing Senator Moynihan as a prophet 50 years before his time. I think he'd be very shocked by America today. I believe that the key is education, and why the politics in Washington do not support charter schools when, I mean, if your school's failing and you're trapped, you have no future. But if you live in the same area and are rich enough to go to your own charter school, i.e. private school at your own expense, that basically you were resegregating the cities, not on race, but on economics. The haves versus the have-nots. And what would you do to help the have-nots? Thank you.
Well, education is a perfect example because you have, you have a public education system today that's really considered by many to be a jobs program for adults first and foremost. And decisions are made based on how they will affect the adults in the system first and foremost. And that is really the only way to explain last in, first out hiring rules, teacher tenure after a couple years in the classroom, and so forth. These are job protection programs. These are not educational policies, even though they are sold as such by the teachers' unions. But things like school choice have pulled off the charts among poor blacks for decades. It's the civil rights leadership that opposes school choice, and they have for a long time. You can go back to the busing wars of the 1970s. The people in these black communities did not want to put their kids on buses and send them miles away every day for school. They wanted good schools built right there in the neighborhoods. NAACP said put those kids on the buses. Of course, their kids weren't on those buses. But so you repeatedly see a certain disconnect between the agenda of the civil rights community, which is to keep themselves relevant, and the actual needs of the people who they claim to speak on behalf of. I mentioned this Black Lives Matter narrative being pushed out there. It is in the interest of Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson to pretend that Bull Connor runs the Cleveland Police Department, because that keeps them relevant. And so that is what they go around pretending is the case. But yes, there's a huge disconnect between people who speak on behalf of the black underclass and the actual needs of the black underclass. And of course, the media keeps running to the same folks to speak on behalf of blacks, which is part of the problem in getting an alternative perspective out there.
Mr. Riley, it's been an honor to hear you speak. And I'm just curious, how do you see the self-help happening that you sort of prescribed for the black community in the face of what I think a lot of people would call internalized racism, as you mentioned with your niece and her sort of adverse reaction to her uncle talking white?
Well, for me, it's a matter of getting back to a certain mentality and attitude that used to prevail among blacks, but that hasn't for generations. Primarily, I would argue, due to the fact that the government has stepped in and tried to do things for blacks on their behalf, and it's created a sort of dependency, a sort of victim mindset that is nurtured today. I spent a lot of time speaking on college campuses, and it's as if these kids today are trained to be as sensitive as possible to any possible slight. I was reading an article a few months ago about a comedian, Chris Rock. He gave an interview saying that he doesn't even do gigs on college campuses anymore. He says the kids they're too sensitive. They can't take a joke. And I found that striking. He says, I can't even tell a joke without getting slammed for being too sensitive. So, but for me, it's about getting back to a sort of self-help, self-development mindset. You have to keep in mind that when people like Martin Luther King were doing what they were doing, their attitude was, blacks must succeed notwithstanding racist society. We need to do what we need to do. We need to get our act together. We need to make progress. We need to educate ourselves. We need to develop skill sets and so forth to survive in a racist society. The mentality of the civil rights movement today is completely opposite. It is, until racism has been vanquished from America, do not blame us for any of these bad outcomes. It's been completely flipped on its head. And they've succeeded remarkably in spreading that viewpoint to younger generations. And so I think that's got to change.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum featuring Jason Riley, author, Wall Street Journal columnist, Fox News contributor, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Mr. Riley, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Our forum is now adjourned.